Losing Crimea may be unsurvivable for Putin for a reason that may surprise you. In 2014, Putin got lucky. Ukraine was briefly incapacitated by the democratic ferment of the Maidan. Catching Ukraine in the west off guard, Putin sent in little green men and illegitimately captured Crimea, and listen to this, with almost no bloodshed. A year later, Putin was at the Massandria winery in Crimea, illegally drinking a 240-year-old sherry with his mate Sylvia. And then he celebrated.
Крым и Севастополь возвращаются в родную гавань.
All of this you probably know, but here is what you possibly don't know. What Putin did in 2014 wasn't new. He was repeating an event that happened 250 years earlier and became a central event in Russia's imperial self-image. Putin wasn't just annexing territory illegally from Ukraine, he was also tapping into a kind of inner territory, a kind of archetypal inner landscape. In 1774, Crimea got detached from the Ottoman Empire, and 9 years later, in 1783, the Russian Empire under Catherine the Great annexed Crimea. And listen to this carefully, without a single shot being fired. What is going on here? Well, let's get poetic together to find out. Here is Ermil Kostrov, the Russian poet, writing about the annexation. Blossoming Tavrida, grow proud of your fate, without the clash of arms, without the stress of thunder, the hero subdued you. And here is Gavrila Derzhavin, writing in 1784. Which god, which angel, which friend of humanity crowned us with bloodless laurels, gave us trophies without battle. And here is Mr. Putin in 2014. They keep talking about some Russian intervention in Crimea. At this point, he is denying it. Some sort of aggression. This is strange to hear. I cannot recall, which of course he can, a single case in history of an intervention without a single shot being fired. Why this 250-year-old obsession with Crimea? Sit tight, because the answer is extraordinary. Russians think that Crimea is their ancient Greece, and they think that they are the true heirs to ancient Greek culture. Russians, I mean, come on, you're not serious.
Putin says that we are Russia and we gotta have Crimea now!
Okay, this sounds mad, so let's break it down. Catherine the Great's Greek project was about making Russia more European than Europe, by demonstrating that Russia alone among European cultures had a direct link to ancient Greece. And it took Trumpian levels of revisionist historical jiu-jitsu to get there, to equate Constantinople, Byzantium, with Athens, ancient Greece. The wonderful Russian historian Andrei Zorin described this in the 90s, long before the 2014 annexation. Here is my cartoonish reconstruction. Move number 1. Due to a marriage of a Kievan prince to a Byzantine emperor's daughter, we, Russia, are the single heir to the Byzantine Church. Move number 2. Christian Byzantium historically succeeds ancient Greece. Move number 3. Historical succession must entail continuity of religious tradition. Therefore, Russia's Christian faith comes from Greece, and therefore, to quote Zorin's analysis, Russia is the only indisputably legitimate heir to classical Greek culture. Now, Russia didn't conquer Greece, but annexing Crimea with its Greek monuments and relics rekindled Russia's link to Greek civilization. So you've annexed a rocky peninsula and now you think you're Homer, basically. Well, they actually do. In 1787, when Catherine is on tour in Crimea, Kostrov, who we met earlier, releases a verse translation of the Iliad with a dedication to Catherine. Homer foretold the glory of your days, sovereign. And at the same time, Khrapovitsky recollects in his diaries conversations with Catherine which lamented that Petersburg wasn't built in Crimea. Empires have their utopias, and Russia's utopia centers on Crimea. In the minds of many Russians, Crimea isn't just a territory, but a kind of inner landscape which offers a promise of harmony and paradise. But this gets better and wackier. In his famous book, Vladimir Poperny, who Zorin also quotes, describes how under Stalinist tyranny in the 1930s, mentally, Moscow architecture moved south. Poperny says cultural sensation of the world seemed to slip southward by several degrees. Outdoor spaces and terraces multiplied, as though there was no snow, as though you were in the Med or in the Black Sea. But what came after was even more important. Soviet authorities systematically consolidated the Crimean myth. Here is Zorin. The decisive factor in preserving the memory of the Greek project in mass consciousness is the architectural design of Crimean sanatoriums and pioneer camps. Gravel paths among laurel bushes, the famous Artek summer camp, red kerchiefs and morning lineup, and atop the waves, the Black Sea Fleet with sailors in white and blue uniforms for whom girls were pining. What's missing from these pictures are Crimea's indigenous people, the Tatars. Stalin put nearly 200,000 Tatars into cattle trains and deported them deep into the Soviet Union, far from Crimea. Many thousands died along the way. Crimea was an ethnically cleansed paradise. In 2014, Putin resurrected Russia's imperial obsession with Crimea. It was a hugely popular move, with over 80% of the Russian population approving of the illegitimate annexation. But there was something absurd about him doing it. Remember, Russia's Crimea myth is about Russia self-consciously, almost frantically, rushing to embrace European culture. But the Russia that annexed Crimea in 2014 was anti-European. Putin was using one of the most pro-Western myths in Russian culture as a way of leveraging Russia against, away from Europe, which is absurd and contradictory. Putin climbed onto Catherine the Great's horse, but being the dodgy amateur historian that he is, he sat on the horse backwards. Even though it makes no sense, Putin is married to that myth, and it's going to stay that way. Russia can't lose Crimea without experiencing a destabilization of its imperial self-image. But Russia's hold over Crimea is beginning to look shaky. So what does that mean for what will happen if Ukraine deoccupies Crimea or tries to? And let's be clear, Ukraine may not care what Russia's response is going to be. If it can take Crimea, it will. But we have to be clear that this will have significant consequences. And two scenarios in particular are plausible. The first is total war, and the second is revolution in Russia. Now, we might think that the prospect of Putin losing Crimea is the worst calamity for him. But here is how he might turn it to his advantage. At the start of the current war, Russia took a partial totalitarian turn. Russia became a quarter totalitarian and a three-quarters authoritarian society, turning a passive, depoliticized population into one with a bit more political activation. Putin has wanted to take the totalitarian turn further and further activate the Russian population, but he had no grounds to do it. Facing the loss of Crimea could be an opportunity for Putin to consolidate his power at home. He could blame the Satanist West for taking our beloved Crimea and mobilize the Russian population for total war. Total war doesn't mean World War III. Total war means total war for Russians, making the entire society structured around a long-distance existential struggle against the West. If Ukraine retakes Crimea and Putin's total war gambit fails, Putin's regime may not survive. And what we mean by this is a revolution, but not the kind of revolution where crowds march on the Kremlin, but the kind of revolution where Putin's court takes Putin and sends him for a permanent holiday in one of his villas. But who would replace him and what would happen next? One outcome is a Stalin to Khrushchev, Andropov to Gorbachev style of transition, when a successor who is perceived as weak and controllable by the regime elite is installed in power. And in that case, the first thing such a leader might do is call up Washington and say, listen, how do I begin to lift the sanctions? This could end the war and start a gradual thaw in Russia's relations with the West. The other outcome, which may be more likely, is Putin replaced by a Prigozhinite junta, who we should hope is not going to be powerful enough or crazy enough to use nuclear weapons. But why are we here again? Why are we looking at this needlessly brutal and idiotic application of violence by Russia and the prospect of this all getting worse in 2023? Why did Russia miss its democratic opportunity after the Cold War? And if Russia survives this war without breaking up, isn't it going to miss its next democratic opportunity too? To understand that, watch this video next.